All right, we got Mr. Trutna here. Today, this is what we're going over, two concepts. We're going to be going over how to factor a perfect square trinomial, and then we're going to be going over how to solve an equation by a process of completing the square. Okay, so the first idea, let's first go over factoring a perfect square trinomial. Okay, factoring a perfect square trinomial. Now, a perfect square trinomial, if you recall from the previous day's notes, is any trinomial. So let me give you one: x squared plus 8x plus 16. Okay, so this right here would be considered a perfect square trinomial. Now, keep in mind that not all trinomials are perfect square trinomials. A perfect square trinomial is a very specific type of trinomial. Okay, so how do we know this is a perfect square trinomial? First of all, if you notice, if we took the b value here, which is 8, and if we divided it by 2, we get 4. And if we took 4 and we raise it to the second power, we get 16, which you notice is the c value there. Okay, so you guys, a perfect square trinomial, one, has to be a trinomial, and secondly, if the b value divided by 2 and then raised to the second power is equal to the c value, that is a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so today we're going to go over how do you factor these, and we're going to do it the long way, and then we're going to do 2 examples the long way, and then we're going to do 2 examples the short way. Because there's a definitive shortcut, and if you see the shortcut, you can factor perfect square trinomials rather easily. So, how do we factor a trinomial? Remember, the key is when you factor a trinomial is the strategy that we learned is you want to make a t-chart. And what you do in the t-chart is you take the c value, which is 16, and you want to write down all the distinct pairs of numbers that multiply to make that c value 16. So that would be 1 times 16, 2 times 8, or 4 times 4. Now, one of those pairs will be your answer for your factor only if you can, one of those pairs, add up to make your b value, which is 8. So essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to find 2 pairs of numbers that multiply to make your c value, 16 in this case, but at the same time they have to add to make your b value, which is positive 8, and you can see that is 4 and 4. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that, remember, so when we factor this trinomial, x squared plus 8x plus 16, will factor into the result of 2 things multiplied together, and your 2 things that are multiplied together are x plus 4, and the reason why it's plus 4 is because that's a positive 4, and then your other factor is also a positive 4, so your other factor is positive 4. Okay, so what have we just said? We have just said that x squared plus 8x plus 16, which is a perfect square trinomial, when we factor it, it becomes x plus 4 times x plus 4, but you don't want to leave the answer like that. That means that we have 2 sets of x plus 4s, so we're going to rewrite it as x plus 4 to the second power. Okay, so we started with this trinomial right here, x squared plus 8x plus 16, and when we factored it, we get x plus 4 quantity squared. That would be the process of factoring that trinomial right there. All right, let's do number 2 so we get the hang of this right here. So in number 2, let's start off with x squared minus 10x plus 25. And what we're going to do, once again, is we are going to factor this trinomial right here. Okay, so we're going to do the process called factoring. Now, once again, is this a perfect square trinomial? It's very important that you notice that. So how do you tell? Well, you take the b value, which is negative 10. You divide it by 2. That is equal to negative 5. You raise that to the second power, and notice that is equal to 25, which is your c value. So Since this process leads me to my c-value, this is what's called a perfect square trinomial. So how do I go about factoring a trinomial? Okay, once again, the strategy that we learned is that we made the t-chart. So we're going to find two numbers that multiply to make my c-value 25. And there's only two possibilities, 1 times 25 or 5 times 5. But those, if one of those is the factor, they're going to add to make my b value, which is -10. So what could I do to either one of these pairs to get them to add to make -10? Well, if you notice, if you make both of the 5's negative, -5 plus -5 is -10. -5 times -5 is positive 25. So that means my two factors would be -5 and -5, and that means my two factors multiplied together, I would write it as x minus 5 and x minus 5. Okay, so once again, though, how do we rewrite that? That means we have two sets of x minus 5s, so we are going to have x minus 5 to the second power. All right, so that means that when I start off with the perfect square trinomial, x squared minus 10x plus 25, when I factor it, I get the binomial x minus 5 quantity squared. All right, so if you notice, there's a pattern that's developing. All right, if you notice, when I have a perfect square trinomial, let's take a look at number 1. When I factored it, I had two sets of x plus 4s. Now, where did that 4 come from? Simple. That 4, if you notice, is half of the b value. The b value was positive 8. Half of positive 8 was 4, and those were my two factors, and they were the same. If you look over here, number 2, my two factors were x minus 5 and x minus 5. And if you notice, my b value was -10. Well, what's half of -10? It's -5, and those were my two factors. So that means there's a definitive shortcut on how to factor these perfect square trinomials. So let's take a look at another one. How about x squared plus 14x plus 49? Okay, so the first question is this a perfect square trinomial? Well, remember, the way to tell if it's a perfect square trinomial is take the b value, which is 14, divided by 2, that's 7, raise that to the second power, 7 to the second power is 49. If that equals your c value, then you have a perfect square trinomial. Therefore, this is a perfect square trinomial. So if I say factor this perfect square trinomial, and you understand the shortcut on how to factor the perfect square trinomials, you could avoid having to make the cheat chart because you should already know what the factors are. So a perfect square trinomial is always going to factor into two binomials. And what are the two binomials going to be? Well, they're both going to start with x. And how do I figure out what numbers go here? Now remember, they're going to be the same number. It's going to be half of your b value. What's half of 14? It's 7, positive 7. So we're going to get x plus 7 and x plus 7. And how do we rewrite that? That means we have two sets of x plus 7s. So that means we have x plus 7 quantity squared. So we started with the trinomial, which is a perfect square trinomial, x squared plus 14x plus 49. And when we factor it down, we get quantity x plus 7 to the second power. All right, one more example of this. Let's do number 4 here. How about if I have x squared? Okay, let's do one where, how about plus 7x plus 49 over 4. All right, now don't freak out if you have a fraction involved. First of all, let's see if this is a perfect square trinomial. So let's take the b value, which is positive 7. Let's divide it by 2. Now remember, if it doesn't divide in evenly, leave it as a fraction. And then let's raise that to the second power. That is 7 to the second power is 49. 2 to the second power is 4. Notice that's your c value. So that means that this is a perfect square trinomial right here. Okay, so we can follow the pattern of how to factor this perfect square trinomial. All right, so we're going to factor it out. So how do we factor a perfect square trinomial? By following the pattern, or the shortcut, I guess we could call it. We know we're going to have two binomials. They're both going to start with x, and we know that since this is a perfect square trinomial, the factors will be the same number. So what number do I put here? Well, it's half of the b value. So what's half of 7? It's 7 over 2. Positive 7 over 2. So I'm going to get x plus 7 over 2 and x plus 7 over 2, which means we have two sets of x plus 7 over 2's. So that means that's going to factor into x plus 7 over 2 quantity squared. Okay, so that would be how we factor a perfect square trinomial. All right, so that's the first thing that we're going over. Now the second concept that we're going over is now we're going to go over to how to solve by completing the square. So this is going to be a process that we're going to use to solve for x, and we're going to be using this process here of where we factored the perfect square trinomial. Okay, so let's go over number 1 here, which is x squared minus 2x minus 15 is equal to 0. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is when you're asked to solve an equation by completing the square, the very first thing you want to do is you want to take the c value and you want to move the c value to the opposite side of the equation that the a and the b value are. So we want to take this minus 15 and we want to add 15 to both sides. So move the c value to the other side of the equation. That's going to be your first step. After those 15s cancel out, you're going to get x squared minus 2x is equal to positive 15. 0 plus 15 is 15. And then essentially what we're going to do is we are going to create a new c value. And we're going to use the process of completing the square to make a new c value, okay? And then whatever we put for our new c value here, we are also going to have to add to our new c value right here. Okay, so you're going to add a new c value to both sides of the equation. I noticed when we did this earlier in the week, people weren't adding the c value over here. Okay, so how do I create a new c value? All right, well, I'm going to do that process where I create the perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to take the b value right here, which you notice is negative 2. Remember, you divide it by 2. That gives me negative 1. And then you raise that to the second power, and that equals positive 1. So that becomes your new c value. So put a positive 1 there, put a positive 1 right there. Okay? So then what we do next is we're going to take this x squared minus 2x plus 1, which we just made, by the way, a perfect square trinomial. And what we're going to do to it is we are going to factor this perfect square trinomial. All right, perfect time for my pen to die out right in the middle of the video. So we're going to factor this perfect square trinomial right here. Okay, so once again, how do we factor this perfect square trinomial? Remember, there's a shortcut. It's going to factor into two binomials. They're both going to start with x, and then remember, the number I put here is going to be the same number. And it's that number that I put is going to be half of my b value. What's half of negative 2? It's negative 1. So I'm going to get x minus 1 and x minus 1, and then that's going to be equal to 16. Why 16? Because 15 plus 1 is 16. So this means that I have two sets of x minus 1's, and that's equal to 16. Okay? So I have not solved my equation yet. Remember, we're solving for x in these equations. So I haven't solved it yet. So what I have to do is, to solve for x, I'm going to have to isolate the x. Okay? So how do I isolate the x? Well, I have to get rid of the 2. first. So what's the opposite of an exponent of 2? I'm going to square root both sides of the equation. Why do I do that? Well, that exponent of 2 would cancel out the square root symbol, and I'm left with x minus 1 is equal to, and what's the square root of 16? That is 4, but remember, it's not just 4, it's positive 4 or it's negative 4. Okay, next I'm going to add 1 to both sides of the equation, and when those 1's cancel out, I'm going to get x is equal to, and I'm going to end up with 2 answers for x. One of my answers will be positive 4 plus 1, which is 5, and my other answer will be negative 4 plus 1, which is negative 3. So in this problem, I get x is equal to negative 3, put a comma, 5. Both of those right there are actually your correct answer to that problem. Okay, and it's very important that you put both of those answers in. And the reason why it is because if you recall, these two answers actually tell me where exactly, if I were to graph this, where exactly the graph crosses the x-axis at, okay? All right, so that would be the example of how to complete the square. Okay, let's do another one here where we get nice friendly answers again, and then we'll do a third one where we don't get such friendly answers. So number 2, x squared plus 2x is equal, actually let's do, how about x squared, yeah, let's do x squared plus 2x is equal to 35. Sorry, I had to reach over and my computer shut down for a second. Is equal to 35. So if you notice that in number 2, the c value, which would be 35, is already moved over to the side. So in number 1, we had to move the minus 15 over, but in number 2, the c value, it's actually already moved over to the side that we wanted in. So that's good. Okay, so then what do we have to do? So remember, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new c value. So we're going to put x squared plus 2x plus, we're going to create a new c value. Now remember, you're going to, whatever that new c value is, you're going to add it to both sides of the equation. Okay, so how do I create that new c value? Once again, you take the b value, which is positive 2 here, and we're going to do that method called complete the square. So we're going to take 2, we're going to divide it by 2, that gives me 1. We're going to raise that to the second power. 1 to the second power is 1, and that's going to go right into my new c value. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides of the equation. Okay, then my next step is I'm going to factor this perfect square trinomial. So it's going to factor into 2 binomials. They're both going to start with x. And then remember, the number I put in both spots is going to be the same number, and it's going to be half of my b value. My b value is 2, half of 2 is 1, positive 1, so I get x plus 1 and x plus 1, and that's going to be equal to 35 plus 1, which is 36. So this means I have 2 sets of x plus 1's, and that is equal to 36. Okay, now I'm going to solve for x. So I need to isolate the x. So my first step is I'm going to get rid of that exponent of 2. So the way I do that is I take the square root of both sides of the equation. Okay, this is called solving by using the square root. The exponent of 2 would cancel out the square root symbol. We would get x plus 1 is equal to, and what's the square root of 36? It is 6. And don't just put 6, it's plus or minus 6. Okay? Then I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. Those 1's would cancel out, and this would give me 2 answers for x. And my 2 answers for x would be positive 6 minus 1, which is 5, and negative 6 minus 1, which is negative 7. All right? So my 2 answers would be x is equal to negative 7 and positive 5. So that's how we would go about doing a problem like number 2, where we get that answer there. Okay. Now notice in number 1 and number 2, both of the answers were nice, super friendly answers. I want to do one where we don't get friendly answers, so you know what to do when you run across a problem that's not going to give you a nice perfect square root for an answer here. Okay, so let me do one more example here. This would be example number 3, which would be x squared plus 4x is equal to 3. Okay, so x squared plus 4x is equal to 3. So once again, in this example, notice that the c values already moved over to the right side, so you don't have to move it over. Okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new c value. Okay, that's going to be my new c value. Now, once again, you're going to add whatever the new c value is. You have to add it to both sides of the equation. So how do I create that new c value? Remember, we take the b value right here, which is positive 4. We're going to divide it by 2. That's 2. And remember, that number is going to come into play when we factor. Then we're going to square it. 2 to the second power is 4. And that's going to be my new c value. So I'm going to put a 4 here. I'm going to put a 4 here. Okay? So then my next step is I'm going to factor my trinomial. And remember, this trinomial here, x squared plus 4x plus 4, is a perfect square trinomial. So that means it's going to factor into the same thing twice. They're both going to start with x, and they're going to have the same numerical values. They're factors. What is it? It's half of the b value. What's half of positive 4? It's positive 2. So I'm going to get x plus 2 and x plus 2. That's going to be equal to 7. 3 plus 4 is 7. That means I have 2 sets of x plus 2's. That's going to be equal to 7. And now I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to isolate x. So I need to get rid of this exponent of 2. So I take the square root of both sides of the equation. That exponent of 2 cancels out the square root symbol, and I have x plus 2 is equal to, and now when we get to this, notice the square root of 7 is not a perfect square root number. So if you get something that is a not a perfect square root number, I don't want you to write out some super long decimal. Technically, if you wrote out a super long decimal, it would not be wrong, but if you can't find the square root of the number, just leave it as the square root of the number. Okay? And then we're going to subtract 2 from both sides of the equation. Now notice when these 2's cancel out, I'm going to get 2 answers for x. Now, notice I put this minus 2 not underneath the 7 because I want you to realize that you cannot subtract 2 from the 7 because that 7 is inside this radical symbol. So how would I, and notice I said there's 2 answers. So what are my 2 answers? Well, technically, what's the square root of 7? It's positive square root of 7 minus 2. That's one of your answers. And then the other answer is negative square root of 7 minus 2. So x is equal to, and we would write it like this, positive or negative square root of 7 minus 2. There we go. All right?